When going through NBA history, one of the things that really intrigues me is to look at the teams that had the talent to become dynasties, but for one reason or another, things didn't turn out that way. So I decided to make a video where I went through each decade in the NBA's history and highlight some of these teams that were either champions or consistent contenders, but they never quite reached dynasty status. These aren't the best teams of each decade, they're just the ones that I think could have been dynasties if a few things had gone the other way. Beginning with the first decade of the NBA's existence, the 1950s are remembered as the Minneapolis Lakers' heyday and the beginning of the Celtics dynasty, but there were still plenty of teams who contended throughout the decade, like our first team, the Syracuse Nationals. Now known as the Philadelphia 76ers, the Nats had 3 finals appearances, won a championship in 1955, and made the East Finals 5 other times. The leader of this team was Dolph Schayes, a 12-time All-Star power forward who led the league in rebounds in 1951. Throughout the decade, they also had quality players like Earl Lloyd, a Hall of Famer and great defender, Paul Seymour, a 3-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA, and another talented defender, and All-Stars Red Kerr and Red Rocha. The Nats as a whole were known for being a great defensive team that was mentally tough. They led the league in team defensive rating at 54 and 55. Their 2 finals losses came in 50 and 54, where they had to face the super team Lakers both times. But they finally broke through the next year when they defeated the Fort Wayne Pistons in the 55 finals. The Philadelphia Warriors. The Warriors had a strange decade in the 50s. They started out with 3 straight semifinal losses, and then missed the playoffs for the next 3 seasons. In 1956, they not only returned to the playoffs, but they also ended up winning the championship. They were led by Hall of Famers Paul Arizin, Neil Johnston, Tom Gola, and 2-time All-Star Jack George. Arizin was a 2-time scoring champ, who was one of the pioneers of the jump shot in the NBA. Neil Johnston was a 6'8" center who was a 3-time scoring champ, and the 1955 rebounding champ. Tom Gola was a 5-time All-Star shooting guard, who was one of the best and most versatile defenders of the time. The Warriors made the East Finals in 1958, but once the Celtics acquired Bill Russell, the Warriors' championship hopes were pretty much over. The New York Knicks. Fun fact, the Knicks were the first NBA team to have 3 straight finals appearances in 51, 52, and 53, and they lost each time. In the 1951 finals against the Rochester Royals, the Knicks got off to a 3-0 deficit before winning the next 3 games. They ended up losing the 7th game by 4 points, but this series still remains the closest an NBA team has come to making a 3-0 comeback. Throughout the 50s, they had plenty of Hall of Famers on the roster, like Harry Gallatin, the 1954 rebounding champ, Nathaniel Sweetwater Clifton, a famous Harlem Globetrotter, Dick McGuire, the 1950 assist champ, Carl Braun, Richie Guerin, and 2-time All-Star Kenny Sears. The St. Louis Hawks. The Hawks actually spent the first half of the decade in Milwaukee, but they became real contenders once they relocated to St. Louis and acquired Hall of Famer Bob Pettit. Pettit's resume is honestly pretty ridiculous. 2-time MVP, including the first ever MVP in 1956, 11-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA, 2-time scoring champ, 1956 rebounding champ, 4-time All-Star Game MVP, Rookie of the Year, and career averages of 26.4 points and 16.2 rebounds. Alongside him were Hall of Famers Cliff Hagan, Easy Ed Macaulay, and Slater Martin. The Hawks lost the 1957 finals to the Boston Celtics, which kickstarted a pretty underrated rivalry from NBA history. The Hawks got their revenge in 1958, making them the only team to beat the Bill Russell Celtics in the finals. In 1959, the Hawks acquired Hall of Famer Clyde Lovellette, who helped them reach 2 more finals in the early 60s, but they would lose them both to the Celtics. The 1960s belonged to the Celtics, but even though they won 9 championships, there were a couple of close calls throughout the decade. And our first team was their most frequent finals opponent, the Los Angeles Lakers. A pretty easy choice. They had 6 finals appearances, all against the Celtics. LA pushed Boston to a Game 7 3 times, and they lost all of them by a combined 7 points. They were led by Hall of Famers Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, and later acquired Wilt Chamberlain in 1968. It wasn't just those 3 though. There were plenty of other All-Stars who played for the Lakers, like Rudy LaRusso, a 5-time All-Star power forward who was an excellent rebounder and defender, 2-time All-Star Hot Rod Hundley, 2-time All-Star Frank Selvey, Darryl Imhoff, and Archie Clark. A factor to their shortcomings were a slew of injuries that happened to Elgin Baylor, starting in 1965. But if you ask me, a factor that's not often brought up is how the Lakers were never truly an elite defensive team. Of course, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Wilt Chamberlain, and Rudy LaRusso were all great, but as a team, they only had 1 season where they finished top 3 in defensive rating. For most of the decade, there were only 8 or 9 teams in the NBA, and the Lakers usually finished 4th or 5th in defensive rating. That may not sound bad, but considering the Celtics routinely finished in first place, it was a difference maker. The Philadelphia 76ers, the only champion of the 60s that wasn't in Boston. The Sixers started the decade as the Syracuse Nationals. Before rebranding in 1963, they had a bumpy start with an old Dolph Schayes and Hall of Famers Hal Greer and Chet the Jet Walker. They were constantly eliminated by the Celtics, the Warriors, or the Royals in the first half of the decade. That changed when the team acquired Wilt Chamberlain midway through the 64-65 season. The 65 Sixers ended up taking the Celtics to 7 games in the playoffs that year, and if it wasn't for John Havlicek's last-second steal, they possibly could have won the series. Philly continued to add depth to the roster, like Hall of Famer Billy Cunningham, a crafty scorer who would make 4 All-Star games and 3 All-NBA first teams. But with Chet Walker starting at small forward, Cunningham was the team's 6th man in his early years. Once the team hired Alex Hannum, who had previously coached the 1958 Hawks, the Sixers would win 68 games and the 1967 championship. The San Francisco Warriors. The Warriors started the decade still in Philadelphia, with Wilt Chamberlain, Paul Arizin, Guy Rodgers, Al Attles, Tom Gola, and Tom Sherry. They relocated to San Francisco for the 62-63 season, although Arizin decided to retire rather than move. They made the 1964 Finals, where they lost to the Celtics in 5 games. One of the more underrated what-ifs from NBA history, to me at least, is what Wilt Chamberlain and Nate Thurmond could have done if they had stayed together longer. They were only together for a season and a half, but in the 64 playoffs, they were an excellent rebounding and defensive duo, and that was when Thurmond was only a rookie. Their second title run came in 1967, with new guys like Rick Barry, Jeff Mullins, and Jim King. They ended up losing to Philly in 6 games, but Barry famously averaged 40.8 points in the loss. Barry then left to go to the ABA, and even though Thurmond developed into a star, the Warriors wouldn't become title threats again until the 70s. The 1970s were hard because there was no true NBA dynasty. You could argue it was the Washington Bullets, since they made the playoffs every year and had the most finals appearances. Or you could say it was the Knicks or Celtics, because they both won 2 championships. Whichever you prefer, there's no right answer. The first almost dynasty I have is once again the Lakers. You can break the 70s Lakers into 2 eras. The first was a continuation of the late 60s with West, Chamberlain, and Baylor. And then there was the mid to late 70s, led by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Like in the 60s, the biggest thing that brought down the Lakers was a slew of bad luck. Wilt missed almost all of the 1970 season. Both Elgin Baylor and Jerry West had to miss the 1971 playoffs, and Baylor retired early in the 72 season due to injuries. And if injuries weren't bad enough, the Lakers also had to deal with the New York Knicks, who had Hall of Famers Walt Frazier, Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, Earl Monroe, Jerry Lucas, and Bill Bradley. They faced off against them in the 70, 72, and 73 finals, and the Knicks got the better of them twice. That being said, the Lakers were still able to break through in 1972, thanks to a new addition, Hall of Famer Gail Goodrich. The 72 Lakers are considered by some to be the greatest team in NBA history, and they still have the longest win streak record more than 50 years later. Kareem joined LA in 1975, and even though he continued to rack up MVPs, the Lakers only had 1 West Finals appearance until Magic came to town. The Milwaukee Bucks. Speaking of Kareem, the Bucks were pretty great in the first half of the 70s. Specifically, the 1971 Bucks also have a claim as the greatest team of all time. I've made a whole video about this era. For me personally, the Kareem Bucks have a strange legacy. There were a lot of things going against the Bucks. They existed at the same time as the super team Knicks and Lakers, and they were plagued by lots of injuries during their 1974 finals run. But then again, the only year they won a championship was when they had to face the Lakers without Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, and they avoided having to face the Knicks in the finals. The Portland Trail Blazers. The 70s Blazers only won a single championship in 77 and missed the playoffs 6 times in the decade, but they mostly earn a spot on this list due to the what-if factor. Bill Walton was that guy coming out of college, but injuries ruined what could have been an incredible legacy. He missed most of his first 2 seasons due to an insane amount of injuries. In 1977, when he was able to play most of the season, the Blazers went on to win the championship. In 1978, Walton was having the best season of his career until he broke his foot. He was still named MVP, but he missed the playoffs and the entire 79 season. Another unfortunate case with the Blazers was Jeff Petrie. He was a 2-time All-Star and the Blazers' first ever draft pick in 1970. He was a great scorer, but he was forced to retire in 1976 due to a knee injury. If Walton and Petrie had been perfectly healthy, they may have won multiple championships in the late 70s. In my opinion, the 1980s had the least amount of dynasty-worthy teams. There were lots of great teams like the Bucks, Celtics, the Mavericks, the Rockets, but only 2 teams really broke through to challenge the Lakers and the Celtics. The Philadelphia 76ers. The Sixers made 4 finals, won a championship in '83, and had 2 different MVP winners in Dr. J and Moses Malone. They had plenty of other great players, like Hall of Famers Maurice Cheeks and Bobby Jones, 2-time All-Star Andrew Toney, and later on, a young Charles Barkley. The biggest problem for them in the early '80s was how they just couldn't beat LA, but once they acquired Malone in '83, they were finally able to win. Instead of repeating the next year, the Sixers were famously upset by the New Jersey Nets in the 1984 first round. If you're a fan of Charles Barkley post-retirement, then you've probably heard him say he didn't win a ring because when he joined the Sixers, they were all old and out of their prime. I can understand Dr. J and Bobby Jones being out of their prime, but Malone, Cheeks, and Toney were all still under 30 in 1985, and Barkley had a pretty good rookie season. I think it has more to do with the Celtics becoming stronger at that point than it has to do with the Sixers being washed. The Bad Boy Pistons. If you look past their violent and punishing style of play, you notice how good of a team they really were. Isaiah Thomas and Bill Laimbeer had been with the Pistons since the early '80s, but the team adopted the bad boy image around '86. It looked like they were going to have their first finals appearance in 1987, but Larry Bird wasn't ready to give up the East just yet. The Pistons made the 1988 finals and took a 3-2 lead, but in Game 6, Isaiah injured his ankle. He then went on to have an absolutely insane injured performance, but it was all in vain. The Lakers won Game 6, and then finally Game 7. Midway through the '88-'89 season, the Pistons traded Adrian Dantley for Mark Aguirre, and with their new small forward, they were able to win back-to-back championships in '89 and '90, but their reign was short-lived. The 1990s were obviously ruled by the Chicago Bulls, but if Michael Jordan had never existed, maybe some of these teams could have been the dynasty of the decade. The Houston Rockets. In the 2 years where MJ was off playing baseball, the Rockets stepped up and won back-to-back championships. A common debate is if the Bulls or the Rockets would have won if they faced each other in the finals. When people discuss this hypothetical matchup, they usually only talk about Hakeem versus Bill Cartwright, but I think an underrated aspect most people don't think about is the matchup of Michael Jordan and Vernon Maxwell. Mad Max is one of the craziest players in NBA history, and was one of the only shooting guards who never backed down to MJ. After winning the '94 championship, the Rockets traded Maxwell to get Clyde Drexler. The team finished with a 47-35 record in '95, but Hakeem went on to have one of the greatest individual postseason runs in NBA history. The Rockets attempted to make a big three of Hakeem, Drexler, and Charles Barkley in '97, but by then, a new team had taken over the West, the Utah Jazz. They made the finals twice in '97 and '98, led by Hall of Famers Karl Malone and John Stockton. By the late '90s, they had other key players like Jeff Hornacek and Brian Russell, but the Jazz were also pretty solid in the first half of the decade. With 2-time Defensive Player of the Year Mark Eaton and the underrated scorer Jeff Malone, the Jazz made the West Finals in '92 and '94, and again in '96, before finally making it to the finals. The Jazz had 6 seasons in the '90s where they finished with a top 5 offensive rating, including '98, when they were the number 1 rated offense. Malone won 2 MVPs in '97 and '99, and Stockton won 7 assist titles, but the Jazz did have a reputation for not being able to come through in the big moments. The New York Knicks, the second best Eastern team in the '90s. They made the '94 and '99 finals, and had another East Finals appearance in '93. They were led by Patrick Ewing, and had other notable guys like Charles Oakley, John Starks, Anthony Mason, and later Allen Houston and Latrell Sprewell. During their peak years under head coach Pat Riley, they finished with the number 1 rated defense in '93, '94, and '95, but they often struggled offensively. Even though they lost the '94 finals, that playoff run was pretty great. They beat the Bulls in 7 games, then the Pacers in 7 games, and then took the Rockets to 7 games before eventual defeat. They had another great run in 1999, where they became the only 8th-seeded team in NBA history to make the finals, but they were defeated by the up-and-coming San Antonio Spurs. The Portland Trail Blazers. The Blazers made the 1990 and '92 finals, but lost both times, first to the Bad Boys and then the Bulls. The Blazers had lots of talent. They were led by Clyde Drexler, but you also had guys like Terry Porter, Buck Williams, Jerome Kersey, Kevin Duckworth, and Clifford Robinson. Under coach Rick Adelman, they had a great stretch of seasons where they finished with 59 wins, 63 wins, 57 wins, and then 51. Michael Jordan even said in the early '90s that the Blazers were more talented than the Bulls, but their biggest weakness was their lack of mental toughness. They were incredibly talented, but they didn't have a togetherness that most champions do, and it ultimately held them back. The 2000s belonged to the Lakers and the San Antonio Spurs. The West in the 2000s is arguably the most loaded conference in NBA history. There were lots of teams I considered highlighting, like the Suns, the Kings, the Rockets, the Nuggets, but the Western team I decided to go with was the only one not named the Lakers or Spurs to make it out of the West in the 2000s, the Dallas Mavericks. In the 2000s, the Mavs finished as the second highest winning team, only behind the Spurs. They had two different eras in the decade. The first was with Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash, and Michael Finley, under head coach Don Nelson. If you don't know a lot about Michael Finley, watch some of his old highlights. He was a two-time All-Star, and the dude could play. This team made the 2003 West Finals, but Dirk missed half the series, which led to the Spurs beating them in 6 games. The second era of the 2000s Mavs was when they had Dirk, Jason Terry, Josh Howard, and they were coached by Avery Johnson. In my humble opinion, Jason Terry has a realistic case for being the best player to never make an All-Star game. I think he was the Mavs' best player in the 2006 Finals, even more so than Dirk. The 2007 Mavs had an all-time great 67-15 regular season, but they were famously upset by the Warriors in the first round. At least the Mavs finally broke through in 2011. The Detroit Pistons. For my money, the 04 Pistons are probably the most loved underdog team in NBA history, or at least the most popular. They were led by Ben Wallace, a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, who is now deservedly in the Hall of Fame, Chauncey Billups, aka Mr. Big Shot, mid-range master Rip Hamilton, king of the technical Rasheed Wallace, and their Swiss Army knife, Tayshaun Prince. After winning the 04 championship, the Pistons made it back to the finals in 05, but they lost to the Spurs in a tough 7-game series. In 2006, the Pistons finished 64-18, but they lost to the Miami Heat in the East Finals. Ben Wallace became a Chicago Bull in 2007, and even though the Pistons still made the East Finals in both 07 and 08, they were never able to add another championship. The Boston Celtics. The big three of Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Ray Allen may seem like a disappointment in hindsight, since they only won a single championship, but for a short time, they really were incredible. Supporting the big three were guys like future Hall of Famer Rajon Rondo, Kendrick Perkins, 6-time All-Defensive Guard Tony Allen, Big Baby Glenn Davis, and of course, Brian Scalabrine. The Celtics won 66 games and the 08 championship. They had another 60-win season in 2009, but Kevin Garnett injured his knee and was unavailable for the playoffs. When he was back in 2010, the Celtics made it back to the finals, but they lost to the Lakers in a tough 7-game series. The Celtics had moderate success in the early 2010s, but their championship window had closed by the time a new big three had emerged. The decade we most recently finished were the 2010s. The Warriors won 3 championships with what some consider to be the most unstoppable team in NBA history. Like the 80s, the 2010s had lots of great teams, but I think that there were only 2 teams that were really close to dynasty status. The Miami Heat. Even though I was just a casual fan during the Heatles' heyday, I still refer to them personally as my most nostalgic team. As good as the big three were, there were a lot of factors that held them back. Of course, there was LeBron's famous meltdown in the 2011 finals, but after that series, LeBron seemed like the only guy on the team that didn't burn out. After 2011, Dwayne Wade's knees became a problem. Even though he still played well the next few seasons, he clearly wasn't the beast he was in the late 2000s. Also, nobody really wanted to trade with the Heat. The best pickups they got during their title runs were Shane Battier, an old Chris Anderson, and of course an old Ray Allen. LeBron and Bosh were in their late 20s, but the only really young guys on the Heat were Mario Chalmers and Norris Cole. They also had to deal with the San Antonio Spurs, who they narrowly beat in 2013, but in 2014, they were unfortunately on the receiving end of the greatest team shooting in NBA Finals history. The Cleveland Cavaliers. LeBron's second stint with the Cavs resulted in 4 straight finals appearances and one of the greatest championships in 2016. Unfortunately, they ran into the Warriors each time. In the 2015 playoffs, Kevin Love was injured in the first round, and Kyrie Irving famously went down in Game 1 of the finals. The Cavs got their revenge next year, when they came back from a 3-1 deficit to bring Cleveland its first championship, but the celebration was short-lived. Kevin Durant joined Golden State in the offseason, and basically had a stranglehold on the league for the next few seasons. Kyrie left after 2017, and the Cavs basically changed their entire roster midway through the 2018 season.